I took all the money from my wife's bank account. After catching her cheating on me, and disappeared, I still remember the exact moment my world shattered. It was a Tuesday evening. One of those evenings that felt perfectly ordinary until everything changed. I'd come home from work, exhausted but looking forward to the familiar comfort of my own space. Instead, I walked into a nightmare I never imagined would be my reality. It started with a seemingly insignificant detail. Ella's phone left on the kitchen counter. I hadn't seen it there before, and as I reached to put it back in its place, a notification on the lock screen caught my eye. It was a text message from someone named Jake that read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." My heart pounded as I quickly looked around, my mind racing. I wasn't a snooper by nature, but something about that message struck a nerve. I glanced back at the phone, hesitating for a moment, then picked it up. I unlocked it using her fingerprint, something that had been done out of convenience. What I found next was like a punch to the gut. There were multiple messages between Ella and Jake. They were intimate, filled with promises and plans that were deeply personal. I read through them, feeling each word like a dagger to my heart. The most recent thread was particularly painful, discussing details of a planned rendezvous and expressions of affection that were meant for me, but now belonged to someone else. I dropped the phone onto the counter, my hands trembling. I felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under me. My mind struggled to piece together the fragments of what I had just discovered. Ella had been my partner, my confidant. How could she betray me like this? Desperate for answers, I searched through our shared email accounts and found more evidence: flight tickets, hotel reservations, and messages that clearly indicated a series of secret meetings. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that Ella had been living a double life. My mind swirled with disbelief and anger. How long had this been going on? And why didn't I see the signs earlier? It was clear now that the trust I had in Ella was shattered. The person I thought I knew and loved had been deceiving me for who knows how long. As the realization settled in, a cold rage began to replace the initial shock. I felt betrayed on every level, emotionally, mentally, and financially. I needed to act, to do something to regain control over the chaos that had been thrust into my life. I paced the kitchen, trying to calm the storm inside me. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of hurt and anger. How could I respond to this betrayal? What would be the most fitting retribution? It was in that moment, amid the chaos of my emotions, that a plan began to form in my mind. Ella's betrayal had been more than just a personal affront. It felt like an assault on the life we had built together. I wasn't going to let her get away with it without facing some form of consequence. As I thought about the financial and emotional costs of her deceit, a particularly sharp idea took shape. We had always shared finances, a decision that had seemed sensible and practical at the time. Now, it felt like a vulnerability I could exploit. It occurred to me that I had access to all of Ella's accounts, and I could use this access to hit her where it would hurt most: her bank account. I wasn't proud of the idea, but the more I considered it, the more it seemed like a way to assert some control in a situation where I felt utterly powerless. I knew it was a drastic step, but it also felt like a fitting response to the severity of her betrayal. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making her understand the gravity of what she had done. That night, I lay awake in bed, the darkened room a stark contrast to the tumult of thoughts racing through my mind. I kept replaying the messages, proof of her infidelity, and the plan I had started to hatch. Each time I closed my eyes, the vision of Ella's betrayal was there, vivid and unrelenting. The next day, I began to quietly gather the necessary information. I researched how to transfer funds between accounts and made sure I had all the details I needed to execute my plan. It was an eerie process, one that felt both empowering and horrifying. The more I delved into it, the more I realized how far-reaching the impact of my actions could be. I told myself I was doing this not out of malice, but out of a need to reclaim some sense of control. Ella had taken away my trust and shattered the foundation of our relationship. If she had chosen to live a lie, then she would face the consequences of that choice. The following evening, when Ella returned home, she was cheerful, unaware of the storm that had been brewing. I watched her, feeling a deep sense of detachment as she moved through the house. Every smile and casual gesture felt like a cruel reminder of the deception she had orchestrated. After dinner, when she was in the other room, I made my move. I accessed our joint bank account and transferred the funds into a new account I had opened for this purpose. It was a calculated, cold process, and as I watched the numbers change on the screen, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was my way of making her feel the gravity of her actions. As I completed the transfer, I couldn't help but think about how I was about to disappear from her life. It was a drastic move, but I felt it was the only way to truly end this chapter and begin the process of healing on my own terms. The next morning, Ella discovered the empty bank account. Her panic and confusion were evident, and though I didn't see her reaction firsthand, I could imagine it vividly. I had already packed a few essentials and left a brief note, not detailing the reasons, but making it clear that I was leaving. The note read, "Ella, I'm sorry it had to come to this. I need to move on and find my own path. I hope someday you understand why I had to do this. Take care." With that, I walked out of the house and into an uncertain future. As I drove away, I felt a mix of liberation and lingering sorrow. I had taken control of my situation, but the pain of betrayal and the complexity of my emotions remained. The road ahead was daunting. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was taking a step toward reclaiming my own life. The silence of our home felt oppressive as I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the empty coffee mug in front of me. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on everything it touched. But the warmth did nothing to soothe the cold rage that had taken root inside me. Ella had gone out for the day, presumably for one of her so-called errands. I knew better now. I knew that her errands were nothing more than excuses for her to sneak away to meet Jake, the man who had stolen what was supposed to be our future together. The realization gnawed at me, making it almost impossible to focus on anything else. I needed to act. I had been stewing in anger for days, replaying every moment of her betrayal over and over in my mind. Felt as though I was living in a constant state of torment, caught between the desire for vengeance and the crippling pain of knowing the woman I loved had so completely deceived me. The idea of taking action started as a whisper, a dark thought that lurked in the back of my mind. Now, it had become a clarion call. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to strike back, take control in a way that would make Ella understand the depth of her betrayal. The one area where I could still exert some power was our shared finances. It was both a practical and symbolic move, a way to hit her where it would hurt the most. I rose from the table and made my way to the study. Our home office had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could work undisturbed. Now, it felt like the perfect place to plan my next move. I sat down at the desk and booted up my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I tried to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The first step was to review our bank account. We had always managed our finances jointly, a decision that had seemed sensible at the time, but now felt like a glaring vulnerability. I logged into our online banking portal and scanned the account details. I knew the account numbers, passwords, and security questions by heart. The access was all too easy, and the thought of it left a sour taste in my mouth. I was about to betray the trust that had been so thoughtlessly broken by Ella. I pulled up a blank document and began to outline my plan. My aim was to transfer all the funds from our joint account into an account I had opened secretly. It would be a clean sweep, a way to make Ella feel the financial impact of her actions. But I needed to be careful. This was not a decision to be taken lightly, and I had to ensure that every detail was meticulously handled. As I drafted my plan, memories of our life together played in my mind like an old film reel. I remembered the day we had opened the joint account, excited about our future and our shared dreams. It had felt like a symbol of our commitment to one another. Now that very account was going to be the vehicle for my retribution. My mind wandered back to the moment I had first discovered Ella's betrayal. I could still feel the sting of the text messages, the gut-wrenching realization that everything I thought I knew about our life was a lie. The emotional turmoil was still raw, but it had morphed into a cold, calculating determination. I had to balance my rage with a precise plan to avoid leaving any trace that come back to haunt me. I continued typing, detailing each step of the process. I would log in during a time when Ella was likely out, execute the transfer, and then cover my tracks. The more I thought about it, the more I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. It was as if the act of planning gave me a semblance of control over a situation where I had previously felt utterly powerless. The hours seemed to blur as I worked, the intensity of my focus bordering on obsession. I double-checked every detail, ensuring that there were no loopholes in my plan. I had to make sure that the transfer was seamless, that there would be no way for Ella to trace it back to me or to recover the funds. As the day turned to evening, I finally sat back, exhausted but satisfied. Plan was in place. Felt like a final act of defiance, a way to make my mark on the life we had built together. I knew that what I was doing was drastic, but the pain of betrayal left me with little room for mercy. Ella had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and I needed to make sure she understood the gravity of her actions. When Ella returned home that night, I was determined to act normal. I greeted her with a forced smile, trying to mask the storm that was raging inside me. She was oblivious to the turmoil that had been brewing, and I had no intention of letting her in on the secret. Not yet. The evening was uncomfortable, filled with awkward small talk and strained attempts at normalcy. I could hardly focus on the conversation, my mind constantly racing back to the plan I had put into motion. I could almost feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me, a heavy burden that I knew would not be easily lifted. After dinner, I excused myself and retreated to the study. Ella was occupied with her usual evening routine, and it was the perfect time to execute the final step of my plan. My heart raced as I logged into the online banking portal once again, making sure everything was in place. The process was methodical, each click a step closer to completing the transfer. As the funds moved from our joint account to the new one, I felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, satisfaction, guilt, and sorrow. It was a strange and unsettling feeling, knowing that I was dismantling a part of our shared life. Money would be gone, and so would the remnants of the trust that had been so carelessly shattered. When the transfer was complete, I sat in silence, staring at the empty account. The finality of it all hit me hard. I had taken action, but the emotional toll of it was still unfolding. I knew that the consequences of my decision would be far-reaching, affecting not only Ella, but also myself, in ways I could barely comprehend. As I prepared to leave the study, I took one last look at the empty bank account and felt a pang of regret. This was not the path I had envisioned for my life, but Ella's betrayal had left me with little choice. I had made my decision, and now I had to face the fallout. Following morning, I planned to leave. The house would be silent and empty, a stark reminder of the life I was leaving behind. It was time to move on, find a new beginning, and a sense of closure. The road ahead was uncertain. For now, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my own sense of control and dignity. The house was eerily quiet as I walked through the darkened rooms, the shadow of our past life lingering like a ghost. I had just completed the transfer, sending every last penny from Ella's bank account to one I had set up for myself. The finality of it felt almost surreal, as though I were watching a film unfold rather than living through it. I had spent the night at a nearby motel, choosing to distance myself from the chaos I knew would soon erupt at home. The act of betrayal I had just executed was more than just a financial maneuver. It was a statement, a way to make Ella understand the depth of my hurt and anger. But now, as I sat in the dim light of the motel room, I could only wait and watch. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering, bracing myself for whatever would come next. "Mark?" Ella's voice was shaky, tinged with confusion and desperation. "Mark, are you there?" I gritted my teeth, fighting the urge to answer with the venomous words that were bubbling inside me. "Yes, it's me," I said, my voice cold and measured. "What's going on?" Ella's voice broke, and I could almost hear the panic rising in her tone. "I can't access our account. Tried to pay some bills, but everything's gone." "Did you do?" The satisfaction of hearing her distress was almost intoxicating. But I forced myself to stay calm. "Ella, I'm not going to discuss this over the phone. You know exactly why this happened. There was a brief pause before she spoke again, her voice now trembling with a mix of anger and despair. Mark, please, you have to tell me what's going on. We need to talk. I don't understand. I could feel my resolve hardening. There's nothing left to discuss, Ella. You've made your choices, and I've made mine. I've moved on. I hung up, leaving her to deal with the fallout of her action. As I paced the small motel room, I could only imagine the chaos that was unfolding back at our house. I knew Ella would be scrambling to make sense of the situation, and a part of me took a grim satisfaction in the thought. Following hours were a blur of restless pacing and anxious anticipation. My mind raced with the implications of what I had done. How would she react? Would she try to confront me? Would she attempt to retrieve the money? The questions swirled in my head, and I had to fight the urge to reach out and see how things were progressing. Eventually, I decided to drive by the house, keeping my distance, but hoping to catch a glimpse of the aftermath. As I approached our neighborhood, I could see the familiar facade of our home, now feeling like a distant memory. Parked a few streets away and watched from my car, my heart pounding in my chest. Ella's car was in the driveway. I could see her moving around inside the house. Curtains were drawn, but the occasional flicker of light through the windows suggested that she was busy. I watched as she paced back and forth, occasionally picking up the phone and making frantic calls. It was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control for her. A few hours later, I saw a couple of movers pulling boxes from the house. It seemed Ella had begun the process of packing up, likely trying to salvage what she could from the wreckage. I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction, knowing that my actions were causing such upheaval in her life. I had anticipated that she would be hurt and confused, but seeing the reality of it unfold before me was something else entirely. The sight of her trying to piece her life back together while dealing with the loss of her financial security was a bitter reminder of the extent of my own pain. As the evening wore on, I decided it was time to leave. I had watched enough for one day. I drove away from the house, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. The knowledge that I had caused so much turmoil weighed heavily on me. I spent the next few days in a state of limbo, bouncing between different motels and trying to avoid any contact with Ella. Each time I picked up my phone, I saw messages and missed calls from her. Her attempts to reach out were both relentless and heart-wrenching, and I found myself grappling with a complex blend of emotion. One afternoon, as I sat in a small diner, I decided to check my bank account. The funds were safe in the new account, untouched and secure. The thought of that money, now a symbol of my revenge, brought a small measure of comfort. But even as I reveled in the sense of control it gave me, I couldn't escape the gnawing sense of emptiness that lingered. Ella's actions had shattered the trust and love that we had built together. I had sought retribution, but the satisfaction of it was fleeting. I wondered if there was any way to truly reconcile the pain I felt with the actions I had taken. The days turned into a blur of aimless wandering and restless nights. I kept up with the news from mutual friends and acquaintances, learning that Ella had been reaching out to anyone who might know where I had gone. Her desperation was palpable, and while it was a reminder of her betrayal, it also brought with it a wave of guilt. Eventually, I knew I had to make a choice. The money I had taken had given me a temporary sense of power, but it wasn't enough to fill the void left by Ella's betrayal. I needed to find a way to move forward, come to terms with what had happened, and to rebuild my life from the shattered pieces. As I prepared to leave town and start over once again, I couldn't help but reflect on the path I had taken. My revenge had been executed, and while it had given me a sense of closure, it had also left me grappling with the complexities, my emotions. I was moving on, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. Finality of my actions had set me on a new path, and now, all that remained was to face the future, a sense of resolution. The first few days after the money transfer were a whirlwind of emotions for me. I'd thought that the act of taking all of Ella's money would give me some sense of satisfaction, a way to balance the scales of our shattered relationship. Instead, it felt like a hollow victory. The emotional weight of what I had done was heavy, pressing down on me with every passing hour. I had chosen to stay out of sight, hoping to avoid any confrontation or emotional fallout. But no matter how far I ran, couldn't escape the gnawing sense of guilt and unease. My phone continued to buzz with notifications, mostly from friends and family who were trying to reach me, but also from Ella, desperately trying to understand what had happened. First time I answered her call, my voice was shaky, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to confront the reality of the situation sooner or later. Hearing her voice, so filled with confusion and hurt, made it all the more real. "Mark, please, tell me what's going on." Ella's voice was raw, almost pleading. "I don't understand. Everything's gone. I don't know where to turn." "I don't think there's much more to say, Ella," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You made your choices, and I made mine. This was my way of showing you how deep my hurt was." Her silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. I could imagine her sitting in the middle of our empty house, surrounded by the remnants of what used to be our life together. The silence was followed by a sob, a sound that cut through me like a knife. I hung up, unable to bear the emotional toll of the conversation any longer. The days that followed were a blur. I spent most of my time in a small apartment I had rented in a different part of town. It was a modest place, far removed from the home I had shared with Ella. I tried to lose myself in mundane tasks, cleaning, unpacking, and trying to create a new routine. But the empty space around me seemed to echo with the pain and confusion I had left behind. Ella's attempts to reach out continued, with messages becoming increasingly desperate and fraught with emotion. She sent texts that ranged from pleading for answers to outright accusation. I found it difficult to read her messages without feeling a pang of remorse. I had chosen to take the money, but it didn't change the fact that she was still a person I once cared about deeply. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I received a text from a mutual friend. It was a simple message. "I hope you're okay, Mark. Ella's been trying to reach you. She's really struggling right now." The message made me pause. It was a reminder that while I was grappling with the aftermath of my actions, Ella was left to deal with the fallout. I wondered how she was coping, how she was handling the financial stress, and how the betrayal had affected her emotionally. In the weeks that followed, I started to see the impact of my actions more clearly. Ella had been forced to sell some of her belongings and make difficult choices to manage her finances. Her public image had taken a hit, and the emotional toll was evident in the few interactions I had with mutual acquaintances. The more I learned about the chaos I had left behind, the more conflicted I became. I had sought revenge, but the reality of the situation was far more complex. Ella was struggling, and the knowledge that I had contributed to her suffering weighed heavily on me. One evening, as I was sitting in my new apartment, I received a letter from Ella. It was an unexpected and raw expression of her feelings, a letter that I hesitated to open, but ultimately couldn't resist. In the letter, Ella poured out her heart. She spoke of her regret, confusion, and her sense of betrayal. She admitted to her mistakes, but also questioned how things had come to this point. She expressed her desire to understand why things had gone so wrong and how she could make amends. Reading her letter, I felt a mix of emotions. I could see the pain and remorse in her words, and it made me question my own decisions. Had my actions been too harsh? Had I crossed a line that couldn't be undone? The guilt was overwhelming, and I struggled with whether I should respond or simply move on. The following days were marked by a deep sense of reflection. I thought about the person I used to be, the man who had loved Ella and wanted to build a life together. I remembered the good times, the moments of joy and connection that had been overshadowed by betrayal. I found myself questioning whether there was any way to find closure and whether forgiveness was possible. Eventually, I decided to write back. My response was honest but restrained. I acknowledged her feelings, expressed my own hurt, and conveyed that I needed time to heal. I didn't offer forgiveness outright, but I made it clear that I was willing to consider a path toward understanding, even if it meant taking things one step at a time. The letter I sent was a small gesture, but it was the beginning of a process of coming to terms with what had happened. It was a step toward finding some semblance of peace amidst the turmoil. As I continued to navigate my new life, I realized that moving forward required more than just physical relocation. It demanded an emotional reckoning, an acceptance of the past, and a commitment to healing. The journey was far from over, and while the pain of the betrayal was still fresh, I began to see that the path to closure was not just about retribution, but also about understanding and self-growth. I looked ahead with a mixture of hope and trepidation, knowing that the future was uncertain but also full of potential. The aftermath of my actions had been painful, but it had also provided me with an opportunity to learn and grow. As I moved forward, I hoped to find a way to reconcile the past with the future, and to build a new chapter that was defined not by bitterness, but by resilience. The early morning light filtered through the small window of my new apartment, casting long shadows across the room. It was a quiet space, a stark contrast to the chaos that had marked my recent past. The solitude offered me the chance to think, reflect, and most importantly, find a semblance of closure. I sat at the small kitchen table, sipping coffee and gazing out at the street below. Life in this new city felt distant and alien, yet it was precisely what I needed. I had chosen to leave behind the familiar and painful reminders of my life with Ella, hoping that distance would help me heal. But healing was never as simple as just walking away. It required confronting the reality of what I had done and how it had impacted everyone involved. In the days following my decision to ghost Ella, I had been plagued by a mix of guilt and relief. I knew that taking all of Ella's money was an extreme action, one that I had justified in the heat of my anger. Yet as the weeks went by, I couldn't escape the growing realization that my revenge had left a wake of destruction far greater than I had anticipated. I had received several letters and messages from Ella, each one a plea for understanding and attempt to make sense of my action. The emotional weight of her words was heavy, and despite my initial resolve to maintain distance, I found myself drawn to them. Each letter was a reminder of the life I once shared with her, and the pain of her betrayal was juxtaposed with the pain of knowing that I had played a part in her suffering. One evening, I decided to sit down and write my final letter to Ella. It was an attempt to express everything that I had been feeling and to find closure for both of us. The process of writing was cathartic, allowing me to articulate my emotions and reflect on the lessons I had learned. In my letter, I began by acknowledging the depth of my hurt and the reasons behind my actions. I explained that while the decision to take her money was a response to betrayal, it was also an act driven by my own emotional turmoil. I conveyed that I understood the consequences of my actions, and that the intent was never to cause more pain but rather to assert control in a situation where I felt powerless. I also expressed my regret for the collateral damage. Ella was struggling, and the financial strain was a harsh consequence of my decision. I had never intended for things to spiral to that extent, and the realization of her suffering weighed heavily on me. My actions had been driven by anger and pain, and while I couldn't undo what had been done, I wanted her to know that I was aware of the impact. The letter was honest and raw, a reflection of my journey from anger to introspection. I wrote about my struggle to find meaning in the chaos and the steps I was taking to rebuild my life. I shared how the experience had forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and how it had taught me about forgiveness, both of others and of myself. In the final paragraphs, I conveyed my hope for Ella's future. I wished her well, acknowledging that despite everything, there was still a part of me that wanted her to find happiness and peace. The letter was not an offer of reconciliation, but a gesture of closure, a way to end our chapter with some semblance of understanding. Sending the letter was a significant moment for me. It symbolized the end of a painful period and the beginning of a new one. I knew that it wouldn't erase the hurt or fix the past, but it was a step toward finding peace within myself. As I continued to settle into my new life, I focused on creating a sense of normalcy. I immersed myself in work, built new routines, and made an effort to connect with new people. The city was unfamiliar, but it offered a chance to start fresh. Each day was a new opportunity to move forward and to build a life that was no longer defined by the past. The journey to closure was ongoing, and it involved more than just reconciling with Ella. It required coming to terms with my own actions and understanding their place in my life. I had to learn to forgive myself for the hurt I had caused, and to find a way to heal from the pain of betrayal and retribution. Finding closure meant acknowledging that while my actions had been driven by a deep sense of hurt, they had also been part of a larger journey of self-discovery. I had learned about my own capacity for anger and the consequences of letting it dictate my action. I had also learned about the importance of empathy, forgiveness, and the need to take responsibility for my choices. As time went on, the emotional intensity of the past began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm and acceptance. I started to see the situation from a broader perspective, recognizing that while the past was marked by pain, it was also a catalyst for growth and change. The final chapter of this story was not one of grand resolutions or dramatic reconciliations, but rather a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons learned and the steps taken toward healing. I had faced the pain, taken responsibility for my actions, and worked toward rebuilding my life. The future was uncertain, but it was filled with possibilities and the promise of new beginnings. As I looked out at the city from my apartment window, I felt a sense of hope. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I was ready to embrace the future, armed with the knowledge that while the past could not be changed, the path forward was mine to shape. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. See you next time.